For anyone who knows me, it's clear that I love telling horror stories. However, today's story is not just an urban legend or a ghost tale. This is my own experience with something that should never have been awakened, the mirror of despair. If you think you know what fear is, get ready to face the true face of terror. It all started on an ordinary day. I had just released a new video on my channel and was checking the comments when a follower sent an intriguing message. He had discovered an old mirror in an antique shop that, according to the owner, was cursed. Curiosity is something innate to me, perhaps too much for my own good. I decided to visit the shop, which was on the other side of the city. The atmosphere was antiquated, filled with objects that seemed to have come out of a horror museum. Entering the shop, I was immediately enveloped by a musty smell and a feeling of weight, as if the place housed ancient and dark secrets. An old man greeted me with a tired and somber look. "You came for the mirror, didn't you?" he asked, without giving me time to explain who I was. I nodded, curious about the object that could serve as incredible content for a new video. The man led me to the back of the shop, where a large mirror framed in old gold rested in a dark corner. Its dimensions were intimidating, and the surface of the mirror seemed to absorb light instead of reflecting it. The old man looked at me seriously. "This mirror is not like the others. It reveals your worst nightmares, and sometimes, it makes them real." This seemed perfect for new content, so I decided to buy it, despite all the owner's warnings. He helped load the mirror into the car and, with one last look of warning, watched me depart. I got home later that night, eager to explore and record what would happen with the mirror. I placed it in my studio, turned on the cameras, and began to narrate the story of the object, explaining the legends surrounding it. Everything seemed normal until, during the recording, I sensed the strange feeling of being watched. I looked directly into the mirror and, for a brief moment, saw a figure behind me. I turned quickly, but there was nothing. I decided it was time to stop for the night and continue in the morning. As I reviewed the footage before going to sleep, I noticed something disturbing. The figure I had seen in the mirror was clearly visible in the video, but it disappeared when I turned to the camera. Fear began to take hold of me, but the desire to understand what was happening was stronger. That night, my dreams were invaded by intense nightmares. I walked down a dark corridor, surrounded by narrow walls that seemed to move. At the end of the corridor, the mirror awaited me, and the dark figure was there again, advancing towards me. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. The next day, I decided to investigate the mirror's history further. I contacted the shop owner, who reluctantly provided more information. That mirror belonged to an ancient sect that practiced forbidden rituals. "They say they use the mirror to invoke and imprison evil spirits," he explained. With this new information, I decided to approach the mirror differently that night. I set up several cameras around it and sat in front of it, determined to discover the truth. As I spoke, the atmosphere in the studio began to change. The temperature dropped drastically, and a fine mist began to form before the mirror. And then, I saw the dark figure again. This time, it did not hide. Slowly, it began to emerge from the mirror, passing through the mist towards me. My body froze with fear as the entity approached. It whispered something unintelligible, and for a moment, I thought I was about to die. But, as if awakened from a trance, I managed to move and run out of the studio. In the living room, I sat panting, trying to process what had happened. The footage from the cameras clearly showed the figure approaching me, and more disturbingly, the entity seemed to feed off my fear. Over the following nights, the nightmares became more intense. The dark figure seemed more familiar until I realized it was taking on the forms of people I knew, but horribly distorted. Each time I woke, I felt a part of me had been drained. Desperate to understand the curse better, I decided to take an investigative trip to the city's libraries and historical archives. I discovered that the sect behind the mirror had made a pact with entities from another dimension, believing they could control these entities through their rituals. However, most of the members had been consumed by the evil they invoked. In an old library, I found a series of manuscripts mentioning the Mirror of Despair and the terrible fate of those who dared to open the portal. I spent hours immersed in reading, absorbing every grotesque and terrifying detail. One phrase, in particular, caught my attention. "The mirror is the key to both liberation and destruction. The one who possesses it must understand its power and its curse." Back in the studio, I felt a strange urgency to stop the entity. I spent days studying the manuscripts and preparing protective talismans. During this time, I noticed subtle changes around me. Objects moved on their own, whispers echoed through the walls, and shadows lurked beyond the edge of my vision. The constant feeling of being watched became unbearable. One night, while reviewing my notes, I felt an overwhelming presence approaching. I looked at the mirror and saw the figure again, sharper and more threatening. It was no longer content with just scaring me. The entity wanted something more, my soul. I decided I needed to undo the mistake I made by bringing the mirror home. The first person I thought to seek out was the owner of the antique shop, but when I entered the shop, I found the place empty and abandoned, as if time had frozen there. With no one to turn to, I returned home determined to confront the entity head-on. That night, I prepared the studio for a final confrontation. I placed the mirror in the center of the studio, lit candles around it, and drew protective symbols on the floor. The atmosphere was dark and heavy, as if darkness itself had come to life. At midnight, I began reciting the prayer I had found in ancient manuscripts. Gradually, the mist reappeared, and the dark figure formed again. But this time, I was prepared. I used the talismans and a prayer to contain the spirit, which seemed to fight desperately to break free from the mirror. The struggle was intense, and for moments, I thought I would fail. The entity advanced towards me with a supernatural force, and the room was illuminated by a sinister glow. As I recited the sacred words, I felt a malevolent presence drawing nearer, whispering promises of power and glory in exchange for surrender. But I was determined to resist. At the height of the confrontation, the spirit let out an agonizing scream, and was sucked back into the mirror as its frame cracked and sank. The battle didn't end there. The mirror began to vibrate violently, and an invisible pressure pushed me to the ground. I screamed the last words of the prayer with all my might, and an explosion of light radiated from the mirror, shattering it into hundreds of pieces. The entity released a final regretful scream, before disappearing into the air. With the mirror now destroyed, the suffocating feeling of fear finally diminished. I felt an overwhelming relief but knew it had left permanent marks on me. The following weeks were a period of recovery and reflection. Physically, I healed from the wounds and scratches obtained in the battle, but the mental scars took longer to heal. I decided that I couldn't simply forget what happened. I needed to understand the consequences of that curse. I sought help from experts in the occult and parapsychology, hoping to find answers or, at least, solace. One of my most memorable interviews was with Dr. Elisa Moretti, a renowned Italian parapsychologist. She listened to my story seriously, taking detailed notes. She was intrigued by the level of the entity's interaction with the physical world. "You touch something very old, something that transcends our conventional understanding of good and evil," she explained. "The residual energy you feel is common in cases of encounters with high-level entities." Dr. Moretti recommended that I continue using protective talismans and perform regular energy cleansings in my home. She also suggested that I share my experience to warn others of the dangers of ancient and cursed objects. That's what brings me here today, to share my story with you, my followers. Not just as an account of horror but as a warning. There are forces in this world that should not be provoked. If you ever come across an object that seems to have a dark past, think twice before bringing it home. Some horror stories are not just legends, they are real, and their consequences can be dire. After everything that happened, I focused on creating content for the channel again, though with a new perspective on the unknown. My followers noticed a change in the way I told stories, and the depth with which I investigated each case. The experience with the Mirror of Despair became a landmark in my narratives, and many consider this video the darkest and most intriguing ever posted. I continued to receive messages from people who claimed to have had similar experiences with ancient objects and supernatural occurrences. Some reported stories of possessions, others of encounters with entities, sharing their own battles against evil. The community that grew around my channel began to take these encounters more seriously and cautiously. Even with the mirror destroyed, there were moments when the remnants of the darkness manifested. On quiet nights, I could still hear faint whispers and disconnected dreams with images of dark corridors and shadowy figures. The entity seemed to have left an indelible mark on my psyche, and I knew that, somehow, it was still connected to me. I decided to confront these remnants by taking a trip to the place where the mirror was originally created. I traveled to a small village in the interior of France, following clues from the ancient manuscripts. Although the journey was long and exhausting, I felt it was necessary to understand the origin of the curse to find peace. The village was picturesque, with its lavender fields and vineyards, a striking contrast to the darkness I sought to unravel. In the local library, I found historical records confirming the existence of the sect that created the mirror. They believed they could achieve absolute power by contacting interdimensional entities, but underestimated the malevolence of these forces. Speaking with the village elders, I discovered there was an ancient purification ritual that could help sever any remaining ties with the entity. The ritual had to be performed on a full moon night in a circle formed by ancient stones on the village outskirts. On the night of the ritual, I was accompanied by two elders who brought candles and ancestral artifacts. We wore white robes and silently prepared for the ceremony. The stone circle seemed to radiate a powerful energy, and I felt a strange calm approach. Reciting chants in an ancient language, I threw sacred herbs into the central fire. The smoke rose to the skies, and the full moon shone intensely, bathing the circle in a silvery light. During the ritual, I had a vision. The entity, now weaker and more distant, seemed to be sucked into another dimension, like a shadow fading in the dawn light. As the ritual proceeded, I felt a heavy burden being lifted. I knew that marked the end of my connection with the entity. The elders completed the final chant, and the sense of peace that enveloped me was unparalleled. The journey had come to an end. I returned to the city different, carrying a deep relief knowing the curse had been broken. 6 months after the ritual, no trace of evil was perceived again. The experience transformed me not only as a YouTuber, but also as a person. As someone who now understood the nuances of good and evil more deeply, I decided to share this story with you, not just as a warning, but as a reminder. There are forces in this world that should not be provoked. If you ever come across an object that seems to have a dark past, think twice before bringing it home. Some horror stories are not just legends, they are real, and their consequences can be dire. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it serves as a warning and a reminder of how volatile and dangerous interfering with strangers can be. Just remembering that if you liked the video and want to continue receiving these stories, I invite you to subscribe and activate the notification bell, because as soon as a new video comes out, you can be one of the first to watch it. That done, until the next video.